For everyone, those who haven't made the move and those who have made the move, is there any anxiety about what it's going to mean and how you're going to do it? And because it's billed, I mean, if you read the newspaper, it's like this is a huge shift, and are we going to be ready? And it's almost like earthquake preparation, right? Are we going to be ready for this thing when it's coming? So unfortunately, the lion's share of this presentation was just going to be a demo about how easy it is and how kind of seamless the transition is going to be. But I don't have access to Point&Click here, so I can't get on the the Wi-Fi card on this to work. So I'm going to have to talk through it, and you'll have to imagine your Point&Click screens in front of you. So it'll be a little bit of a guided imagery, virtual demonstration. So bear with me with that. Sorry for that technical difficulty. The summary of this talk. Oh yeah.
I was thinking we don't have, after that I could get on.
Can you get on?
I think so, but if I need internet access, and if we had that, I could remote into Point&Click.
Right. So there is remote access. The only problem is that the security card on this one won't actually let me open up the internet, which is what I need in order to sign in.
Yeah.
So. Were you really?
I think that's my problem, is just getting internet access.
Yeah, but you were able to log in.
I can log in. There is Wi-Fi down there. There is? I can get on.
You want to give it a shot? Because I think that would be really helpful. If you do you know test patient name? Like, do you guys use Mickey Mouse or something like that? That would be easy enough. And if you don't mind me driving, that would work fine. Okay, thank you very much, Gary. Okay, Gary saves the day, potentially. So the upshot of this talk, and I'll say this, and then those of you who want to leave can leave already, is that it's not a big deal. It's not going to be that hard. Point&Click actually has done a very, very good job of making the transition seamless so far, it seems. We'll see if there are any snafus down the road, but there ought not be. So learning objectives for this talk, get familiar with the workflows, preferably through demonstration if Gary's able to get online. And then I'm going to show you a couple of bells and whistles. Well, again, if we can get online, I'm going to show you a couple of extra bells and whistles that 12.8 offers that are kind of nifty, like uploading files to secure messages and text messaging. So as an overview, we'll give you an intro to the ICD-10. There's not a whole lot that you need to know, really. I mean, there's a whole lot to know if you really want to study the transition and the differences and that sort of thing. But for our purposes, none of that is really necessary. Then we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between the DSM-5 and the ICD-10, which I think is important and underemphasized in the media. And then we'll talk about mapping workflows and other functional upgrades. ICD-10, the ICD system was developed worldwide to follow mortality trends. Everyone uses it. The US even uses it to follow mortality trends. The US actually had an agreement with the World Health Organization and developed a clinical modification to use the ICD-9 for all somatic inpatient and outpatient diagnoses. So we've been using this in the US. We haven't been using it in the US, but physicians, doctors, healthcare providers have been using this for a long time, since the 90s, actually. In mental health, we tend to use the DSM system diagnostically, and that's what insurers like to see up until exactly 1 month from today. The ICD-10 itself across the globe has been in use since 2002, so we're late to the game. And as you can see, the 10CM stands for clinical modification, which is just different from just the basic ICD-10. Without the CM, it's used for mortality statistics. With the CM, it's used for clinical and billing use. The ICD-10 it's actually a huge change from the ICD-9 in that they changed the coding format there are about 50,000 new codes which offer an impressive increase in the degree of granularity. So you can really hone in very, very tightly on a diagnosis with those extra codes. About 25% of the diagnoses map directly ICD-9 to ICD-10, just one-to-one. Of the remainder, the rest of the 75%, two-thirds, so that's about 50% of all of the codes map approximately. So there's a pretty close match. So with 75% of the codes, there's a pretty close match. And then there are the problem children. The final 25% of codes map complexly. So there's one-to-many diagnoses. So one ICD-9 diagnosis actually codes to several ICD-10 codes. That would be several necessary codes. One-to-multiple options, where one ICD-9 code maps to several options from which you would want to pick one. And then one-to-multiple sets of codes, which is where one ICD-9 code maps to several different categories of codes from which you want to go in, and you may run into more of these one-to-many and one-to-multiple option codes. So there's a complex system there. And then there are some diagnoses in ICD-10 that are in ICD-9 that are not represented in ICD-10. So there's a one-to-none relationship. This is a minority, obviously, at 25%, but it's still some. So of course, big changes, big transitions always have the potential to bring big headaches. For instance, financial costs to the university, that's one. Insufficient preparation by the UC coding and billing systems is another, by our SHIP systems. If Point&Click is not ready and able to provide the software deliverables and the training to use them properly, that could be a big headache. Insufficient preparation by insurers is a potential issue. And then insufficient preparation by clinicians. Unfortunately, since there's a hard start for this, a lot of this we won't really actually know until October 1st. So for some of these things, we have our fingers crossed. The first one is not your problem, so don't worry about it. The second one is not your problem, so don't worry about it. The third one doesn't appear to be the case so far. Point&Click has really done a good job. And as I step back and listen to myself talk, I'm like, wow, I'm actually singing Point&Click's praises. That's interesting. I don't know about the rest of you, but my experience at Berkeley was when they rolled it out, you know, it's a decent EHR, but there was no training. They were sort of like, here, you know, figure it out. We're like, well, where's the training? They're like, well, just play with it. Okay. So I think now, 2.5 years later, we're pretty adept at it. With the rollout of ICD-10, they've done quite a bit of background work in making sure that what you see on your screen changes very little. And finding your codes, you know, finding your right diagnostic codes is not really going to be very hard. You're not going to have to pick through all of these one-to-many and one-to-multiple types of things. The computer will do all of that for you, which is very, very nice of them to do that. Insufficient preparation by insurers. 40% of payers acknowledge that they're not going to be ready for October 1st. That's frightening. It reminds me of the change in the psychiatric CPT codes that happened back in, was that 2013? Yeah, January 2013, where in my private practice, I would send in a bill with the new codes, and they would say, like, what are these codes? You're supposed to know what they are. So that could be a really significant problem, and at 40%, which obviously is almost half, that could be a big snafu. And some of these are related. So, you know, if our coding people at SHIP are ready, and we send our stuff down to the insurance companies, and they're like, we don't know what to do with these codes. We've never seen them before. We don't know how to use them. Then it could cause a backup and some problems. So we'll hope that that doesn't happen. And then lastly, insufficient preparation of clinicians. Hopefully I'll do something about that here. So those things aren't your problems. The big issues that we need to think about, and this one keep in the back of your mind because it's not really your problem, but it's something that to be aware of. At the end of the day, it may wind up falling in our laps as clinicians a little bit because we may have to have workarounds temporarily while we're waiting for things to happen. And then lastly, insufficient preparation of clinicians. But again, we'll try to deal with that here. Okay, so the US has traditionally used the DSM system for mental health diagnoses and for billing purposes, for both. The DSM-4 and the ICD-9 were roughly consistent with each other, so there's no real brain work to do there. But on the first, we're going to join the rest of the world in using the ICD-10, including with mental health diagnoses, for coding. The ICD system has guidelines for developing mental health diagnoses, for developing clinical diagnoses, but it's not as well developed as the DSM-4. So it's important, and this is a really, really important point, I think, with the whole thing, and I think it's been underemphasized in the media. There's a lot of hullabaloo about, you know, the transition, and are you ready, and do you know all the codes, and how are you going to do this? And in fact, we're not really going to change the way that we do clinical diagnosis. We're going to use the state-of-the-art text, which we use, which is the DSM, to develop our diagnoses, and then we're going to go into Point&Click, and the computer is going to crosswalk our clinical diagnosis into the appropriate code. The term for that is general equivalence mapping. Common term for it is crosswalking. People have heard that term. Point&Click does it for you, so you don't have to worry about it. This is an overview of how DSM and ICD-5 kind of fit, DSM-5 and ICD-10 kind of fit together. So these are the standard diagnostic categories that we're all familiar with and that we see on our campuses. And these are the ICD code groupings. You'll notice that all of the mental health codes start with an F, which is just something to know. And they're all alphanumeric, so you can see which code groups go with which diagnostic entities. And then each code, individual diagnostic code, has anywhere from 5 to 7 digits, 5 to 7 characters, including the alpha digit. So you can imagine numbers spreading out behind this, but again, you don't have to memorize the numbers. I mean, I've been doing the DSM long enough that I know a bunch of the codes. Maybe some of you know codes by heart and that sort of thing, just from familiarity. Well, there are so many more codes with the ICD-10. I'm probably not going to have that luxury of just saying, oh, I know what code that is. But with Point&Click, you don't need to. So again, you don't need to memorize the chart. Once you select a diagnostic major category in Point&Click, it will point you to a list of potential codes that fit what you're trying to say. How you doing, Gary? Any luck?
No, I can't get on the internet.
Yeah. Do you know how you got on the internet?
No, I think it's different than
Because I was having trouble getting.
I got in here. Wi-Fi, like on my phone. I put Wi-Fi in here, and it said Western Meeting Room.
There was an option for the Western Union, but
It wasn't. It got me.
But were you saying that you were on Point&Click up in your room? Really? And you were too? Really? What room are you in? Let's go.
Welcome to Climax.
There may be some security differences on your laptop than on mine. So unfortunately, the demo will be guided imagery. So close your eyes. No. So you can pick the template, pick your favorite template to imagine, but you know that as you that is kind of funny, isn't it?
Pick your favorite.
As you scroll down towards the bottom of the template, there's obviously a place for assessment, and within the assessment window is a place for diagnoses. You click on that, and it gives you a list of diagnoses along the top, a list of what's called major categories across the top: depressive illness, anxiety, bipolar, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So once you see your student and you determine what clinical diagnosis or what clinical area the presentation is in, you just click on the major category, and then what will open up is another page or a dialog box that will give you options for which diagnosis you think fits. Now, some of them are hyperlinks, And this is where that idea of granularity comes through, because for some of them you can just go ahead and click a box and there's your diagnosis. For some of them it's a hyperlink. If you click the hyperlink, it'll go to another page, like another layer down of more options. So there's a little, there may be for some diagnoses some extra click steps, extra pointing and clicking, but largely it's all pretty intuitive. And I wish I could show you because it's totally intuitive, and those of you who are anxious about the change really need not be, because it's very, very straightforward, very straightforward. I should have said this at the beginning. If you have any questions or any comments, please interrupt me.
This is since the switch, but when you go into the diagnosis tab, the window, whatever you call it, you have an option to click DSM, ICD, and then custom.
Mm-hmm.
And if you wanted something like no diagnosis or diagnosis deferred, you can only find it in the custom somehow. You don't even find it under DSM.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a reason?
That's a good question. I think it's probably campus to campus for that. I'm going to try to veer away from very interesting discussion that we could have about diagnosing and what the value of that is and when we should and when we shouldn't and how we should, which I think is a discussion that eventually we ought to be having, but we won't have it here. I believe that there is, for billing purposes, for those of us who bill, some of us don't, there's a need to actually put a diagnosis on, right? And diagnosis deferred or no diagnosis, you could imagine that an insurer will look at that and say, great, I have no idea why you spent an hour with this person, but I hope you guys had a good time, right?
So I know I talked to the research, and she said the reason it's DSM-5, there is, at least the other times, there's no diagnosis or diagnosis. But if you customize by campus, I don't think you have that. So they defaulted it from those campus.
And we did that, but I don't think we used the custom tab. I think that we added it into like other conditions. So there's a place you can, under other conditions, you can edit it. And one we use a lot because we do phone triages is diagnosis not assessed. So you say, this was not a diagnostic needed here. So we have to, it's a little bit of a nuisance because we use it so much, and then you have to go to the other, and then you have to find it there.
So the major categories are, and this is part of what you guys are saying, they're customizable from campus to campus. You'll have to talk to your IT folks about how to do that, but you can customize the major categories and call them what you want to and have whichever ones you want out front so that ones that you use commonly are easily accessible. So my advice is to talk to your IT manager about customizing your major categories and to do that thoughtfully to suit your staff's needs. So that might be something that Gary might be taking up with his IT folks to see if they can make that streamlined a little bit or not. Yeah.
We left those. I think on primary care side they did more customization because it's such a bigger deal. We just left. And I understand you all did more customization of that screen, but I think most of the others was just left.
Just left it. Yeah, and I think, and you're right, I mean, the medical side, the somatic medical side of the house, they have so many different things that they could choose from. Yeah. We're going to kind of give it a try at Berkeley, at least the psychiatry side, and sort of see how it goes, and then circle back around sometime during the fall and see if there are any tweaks that we need to do to kind of make it work better for us. But it is kind of flying the plane while you're building it. But fun.
You may be getting to this at some point, but and I don't know enough about ICD-10, but is there an area for what we call adjustment trauma and other things like academic problem, occupational problem, things that are focused with clinical attention that are not
Like V codes?
Yeah.
There are, I think in DSM, no, actually in ICD-10, I think they're called Z codes. Yeah. And that's a good point. I should add the Z codes to this. So, and, right, I'm realizing that trauma disorders is not on here, but I think that they fall in the F42. Yeah.
Do you know if there's, I know in ICD-10 training with PNC, not everything is translating and crossing over. Is there a master list anywhere of what doesn't that's related to DSM or to mental health?
There's a master list that I have not seen that Point&Click used to basically import all of the ICD-10 codes in.
So those were the ones that matched, but there was a set
That didn't match?
Do you know if there's
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure how many of those are mental health diagnoses, to tell you the
a lot of
truth.
them were substance abuse related?
Okay. I don't know. Off the top of your head, do you know any specific codes that were? No.
It was some substance use code specifically that came up in the training, and it wasn't translated, and it was just this gap between,
I see.
like, because we're doing the Chesson study, they need the ICD. So we don't bill mental health services, but for the Chesson study, they need the ICD-10 code. And so it's something that we would diagnose in the DSM one way, but to get the ICD-10 code to pop up, you need to go and do a specific ICD.
Gotcha. I see. Yeah. I don't know. I can't answer that question. I'm not sure. But it brings up a good point that I do want to step on a soapbox for a second, which is that it's important to put a diagnosis down, even if it's a really vague one, for these reasons, because at some point we might want to come back and look at who are we seeing and what are their what diagnostic categories do they fall in? How many people do we see who have depressive spectrum disorders? How many people do we see who have anxiety spectrum disorders? And if we're knowledgeable about these things and not documenting what we know about it, then it really kind of ties our hands in terms of going back later and saying, what did it look like in 2013? Who did we see, and what kinds of diagnoses did they have? That said, if you don't know what someone's diagnosis is, and you haven't really done a clinical evaluation of them, then obviously you can't diagnose them. But I know that there's some debate and some dissonance in how medically trained people and how psychologically trained people, and maybe even how college counseling trained people look at diagnoses. But I think it is a discussion that we need to have at some point. So the rest of this talk, I think you guys are going to get out early because I was going to show you how to text message, but that's going to be hard for me to describe without actually seeing the page. What I can tell you about the secure message attachments and the text messaging is that they both live in OpenChart. And it's actually pretty nice when you open OpenChart and you look along the top row, there will be a little red cell phone, little tiny red cell phone. That gives you the option to text message your students. Now, you'll have to decide from campus to campus what kind of stuff, whether there will be stock messages, which is probably the best and safest way to do it, or whether it'll be something a little bit more free-form. But that's one option that's new. And students will have to register their cell phone number and that sort of thing in order to get this message. And then with secure messages, when you click on the secure messaging, screen, there will be an option for adding uploading files from either the scanned documents. So if there's a document in there, a verification of illness form or a release of information that you want to send to the student in a secure fashion, you'll be able to upload it into the secure message, and they'll be able to, when they log into Open Communicator, they'll be able to get that message. So it's kind of a nifty little bell and whistle kind of thing. And again, campus to campus, you have to figure out how you want to use it, whether you want to use it, and when you want to use it. One of the talks I gave yesterday, I talked about technological advances and making sure that we don't just gobble them up and start using them, but that we employ them in a thoughtful way and kind of figure out how is this going to work for the clinical encounter, how is this going to work for the patient, rather than sometimes IT folks get really excited that computer can do stuff, and they just say, here, hey, it can do this, you should use this because it can do it. But I think we really have to be thoughtful about that. So these are two new functionalities that could be useful to us, but we'll have to figure out how we want to use them. And again, sorry for no demo, but Alexander?
So, are there going to be any changes in that? I'm glad you used the term encounter, but we have to enter encounter codes as well.
Mm-hmm.
Is
The CPT codes?
Yeah.
CPT codes are not going to change. The ICD-10 codes are strictly diagnostic codes. And there's, again, to emphasize, there's no change in the format that we'll be using to make clinical diagnoses. You know, you'll be meeting with your patient, you'll be learning about them by talking with them in a regular clinical encounter, you'll be gathering your clinical information, you'll be putting it through whatever machinery you have in your head to figure out is this an anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, a trauma-related disorder. And when you figure out what your differential is, then you can go into Point&Click, and Point&Click will tell you what the appropriate ICD-10 code is for that clinical diagnosis. CPT coding won't change.
This is unrelated, but I didn't think that CPT coding is totally divorced from ICD or DSM. I mean, who does CPT code? I mean, what is that?
The AMA. The AMA.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. AMA.
Yeah. That's their thing.
Is this something that could happen? You go into Point&Click, you go through what you're used to seeing for your own campus of diagnostic, you pick something out, you click it, and it can't find an ICD-10 code?
I guess that could happen, based on what Vivian was saying. I guess that could happen if there's a one-to-none mapping relationship. I have not seen that happen in the fiddling around I've done, and my sense is that you're not going to get sort of like a bust screen, you know, that the computer will find the best match for you. Yeah, that's my guess, but I haven't actually seen, echoing maybe because I'm in front of these speakers, I haven't actually seen that. Any other questions? Yeah, please.
So with the attachment, I'm thinking, so are you saying will you have the option to be able to select document and scan documents?
Mm-hmm.
So would that be, say if I want to send like some recent information, would it have to be that already scanned into the individual chart, or will we be able to have a set of standard scanned documents? What would that look like?
If, for instance, you wanted to, do you use the handouts function?
Yeah, no.
Okay, so that's one way of sending
Okay, but then
standard
that
stock information.
will have to scan individually to that particular chart in order to populate and scan documents.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So the handouts thing is a different area, but you'll be able to go into scan documents and select whatever document is in there and send it off to a student.
So to clarify, if you have a work folder on your computer that's not P&C,
I do not believe
you
you.
can't upload from there.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Yeah. I think that there's going to be a firewall of sorts around that, so that you can't just pull stuff off your C drive, for instance, and send it to a student. Yeah.
Does P&C have a general bank of scanned documents, or are they all chart by chart?
I'm sorry?
Under the references section,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a repository. That's
So
where.
that would be the place
That's
where
where
you
you
want to
really
start
go
scanning
there,
stuff in
yeah.
to be available.
But I don't know if you could pull, it is in the PNC system, so theoretically maybe you could pull some references.
From there, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think for sure it would have to be within Point&Click in order to use it, yeah.
That's very nice. You have to put it into the individual chart. You can just pull it out of, that references section, or, if you have, various documents that you've loaded into the system. We haven't done a lot of that because this is a new thing.
Yeah.
We've actually been pushing Point&Click for a long, because it's frustrating. It's like, well, why can't I just,
Yeah.
especially because we're limited, we don't want to use email.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Well, our clinicians have been printing them out, right?
Yeah,
Which is
yeah.
a disadvantage if you're corresponding with this assessment.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of this stuff, until we really get in there and start using it, we're not going to know.
Yeah.
We're also, by the way, pretty excited about the text messaging option and
voicemail this generation.
Well, yeah.
It's true. It's really true.
I like to, I like to tell my staff, you know, we need to stay at least 3 steps behind the student. But yeah, you know, you can, whatever the time, I don't know if we figured out the time frame, but whether it's, you know, 24 hours or 4 hours, you know, you just fire a text message to say, hey, don't forget your appointment coming up, or we have this, you know, psychosocial group started that you might be interested, whatever it is. So it's a nice thing, and it's, of course, how most of the students are communicating and
Yeah.
having, you know, very deep interactions through text messaging, which kind of blows my mind.
Yeah, emailing is like the new snail mail, right?
That's right.
Have you thought about how exactly you want to use the text messages, whether you want to use canned messages or whether it'll be up to the individual clinician to send what they want to send?
Not too much. I mean, I think at this point we're probably looking at some kind of automated, like reminder,
Mm-hmm.
through text messaging, you know, rather than how it has been going out.
Yeah,
So, which would be canned.
right.
Pull from the system. This is the time, the place of your appointment.
So no, what's up? Love you.
Oh,
See you soon.
yeah.
Okay.
Because then you can imagine, like, you know, as you were getting yesterday with the secure messaging problem, now you have students saying, having a rough day, you know.
Yeah.
What am I going to do now?
Right.
I'm getting a text from my student.
Yeah. So these are things that we'll have to figure out. For sure.
I'm curious, so the text message feature, does that create another sort of box that clinicians would check so they can see respond to your text message?
That's
Is it one way?
That's a good question that I don't know the answer to, and maybe you.
What can you respond to, you know?
Yeah.
It's coming from the system.
Right.
Things that
So it's a one-way sort of,
Yeah, but I'm gonna ask our IT folks because I'm wondering if there's a toggle switch where you can send and receive, and maybe it comes in as a secure message or something like that. I'm not sure, but it's a good question. It's a good question.
yeah, because I didn't see if you send an appointment reminder, oh, sorry, I can make it.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, I wonder if more of the communication will be considering last minute cancellation of text messages. Yeah, manage that.
So I know I was on the East Coast last week, and I forgot to call my credit card company. It's almost like asking permission, like to tell them that I was going to be in New York. So the first day I went out to buy a bagel and wouldn't take my credit card. And then I got a bunch of text messages from my bank saying, you know, like, did you make this? But they were text messages, but I didn't try to respond to them. I don't know what would happen to those, but I imagine it's probably a very similar system. If I responded to that, probably just not going anywhere.
They probably prompt you to respond. If they say, if it is, you say yes, then you say yes.
They say go online. Yeah,
Very effective.
yeah.
I think for us, that will help. We sometimes have students who like, either they canceled or they, without saying whether they want to schedule or they didn't show up. And then you look at their secure messages and you see this history of unread. So you know, even if you've shown them, somehow they don't go there, et cetera. And then you call them and they don't respond to the phone call, so they're like out there. And the next step for us is like a U.S. mail letter, which probably isn't that So just to be able to say, check secure message. You know, check your email secure message would be.
That's a really good idea. I like that.
Those are the times when I feel like I can't reach them and I'm not allowed to use their way.
Yeah, yeah. No, that would be a really good use. Because we get into that situation, Gloria can speak to this also, we get into that situation where, you know, you're concerned about a student and they're not picking up their phone, they're not checking their voicemail, they're not reading their secure messages, and so like, okay, is it welfare check time? Or, you know, yeah, so that would be a good intermediate step, you know, and would avoid using email, which we try to avoid using.
So, you know, just kind of run this maybe for a minute and talk about Point&Click that, and I really think that, you know, I'm coordinators and that sort of thing. But I'm really happy to see, because these are some things we've been asking for a
Yeah.
long time. You know, another area that I'm guessing you're not going to get into, this doesn't have as much to do with psychiatry, but there's going to be some changes in how we can schedule outreaches and even the
Groups, yeah.
So we're going to try to get some in-service and then share that back out. But the whole sort of idea of setting up, I think what most of us have done is set up like a dummy patient and like, you know, CAPS outreach or whatnot, and then put all of them in there. And it's kind of clunky and it's hard to run reports on. And now in this way, it's going to be built through open schedule, and it's going to be much cleaner, and we're going to be able to count up how many people came in and you know, things like that. So
You'd be able to duplicate notes also for groups.
yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, these two new bells and whistles are only two of the new bells and whistles, as Gary's saying. With the group things, I think there's going to be some changes, some streamlining of group rosters and note writing for groups. So you'll be able to like write your group, your general group note, and then copy it to a bunch of different charts, and then add a little bit to it if you need to for that individual patient. But rather than having to go in and write, 10 notes for each of the 10 people in your group.
We're also, I think that for the outreaches, there may be a way for students to go on to Open Communicator to sign themselves up, which is kind of cool.
Great.
For the outreach activities.
Yeah.
And it's a link, it maps, you can do branching pages between outreach and or things that require intake, like before and after. Yeah.
So it'd be great if Sam and Elizabeth Hirsch can put together some kind of training so that we're all on the same page with regard to all these enhancements, because every change requires new work.
That's right. And kind of behind the scenes here, we're also working on these enterprise-wide reports.
Mm-hmm.
And, when kind of what I see part of my role with the other directors is let's all stay together here as a herd, because if only half of us do it and the other half says, well, I'm sticking to the old way, because that was better, then when you try to write a report, it's like, okay, well, this is half our system, we got this great data, and we don't know about these other guys. So, that's right.
Does anyone know of any enhancements in the report, the production of the report? Because currently, this year, I essentially use Excel for everything.
Mhm.
Filter, so I want to know how many of our outreaches were workshop presentations, graphs, and it requires me to run a report, upload it to Excel, clean the data, then create filters, then sort of filter it out.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tedious process. But do we know if the report production and
I don't know about that. I agree with you that running some reports is pretty clunky. Some of them come out fairly cleanly,
Yeah.
but other ones are definitely kind of clunky.
So Sam Park at Mrs.
Yeah.
San Diego is working to put together stuff, and he has promised that he's going to.
Yeah, and I think specifically on that one, because of the changes in how we're going to be tracking the outreaches,
Yeah.
you will be able to write better reports, but I have to do the same thing with a lot of other stuff. You can get so far, then you got to put it into Excel and play around.
you get your separators and all that?
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for coming.